Welcome back, everyone. What a perfect segue. Crypto to cyber insurance. Mike Dickey said on the last panel, this is a critical issue if you're going to go into business with somebody in cyber, with someone in crypto, and you're worried about breaches relating to that crypto. So let's talk. This panel has always been the most popular every year, I think, and it just keeps getting more and more because of the way insurance plays out. It is the very first question that I ask whenever I am contacted on a Sunday afternoon, which is when it typically happens, about some sort of attack. Okay, what kind of insurance do you have? So we have a great panel for this. Let me go through them all real quick and we'll get to the discussion. First up is Scott Goddess, the John Rambo of cyber insurance battles. You will see from Scott's bio, he is co-chair of Barnes and Thornburg's Data Security and Privacy and Insurance Recovery and Counseling Groups, where he has helped insured recover more than $1 billion. Has that number gotten to $2 billion yet, Scott?
On its way.
You've been slacking. What you will not, you'll see from Scott's bio that he's that chair, but you will not see in his bio is that for cyber insurance who decide not to pay, Scott has perfected his cyber insurance practice into an art form, because he's not just the expert who will take on the case. If it goes to appeal, which several of his cases have gone, Scott will do your appellate work for you. And that's typical of your incident response lawyer. They really will take on whatever is assigned to their client. And and guess what? He doesn't lose those appeals either. One of them, I think he won, and one of them settled. And he'd never say this, but I'm going to say it. Whatever settlement he got, that was a win. What I love about Scott, his writings and his posts and other publications, a lot of us do writing. I think Scott's really at the top of that list, required reading for everybody. It's very hard to stay up on the latest cyber insurance cases, and he keeps you there. So welcome, Scott. Great that you're here.
Thanks, John.
Next up is Seth Harrington, whose bio will tell you that he's part of the ever-growing IR and privacy legion at Orrick, where, like so many experts today, Seth counsels clients through all stages of privacy or data security incidents, navigating the array of legal issues that arise, managing the response and investigation, defending clients against litigation, all of it. But what you may miss from Seth's bio is that even among the pantheon of IR experts we have here today, his retail IR experience is just insane. Just a few of the companies where he's worked the IR: Arby's, Landry, Hilton, Sally Beauty, SuperValue, Home Depot, Aldo, Genesco, Heartland, TJX, Wyndham. The list goes on and on. Seth Harrington should have anticipation of litigation on his business card, license plate, and tattooed to his forehead. That is my view. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you, John.
Excellent. Next up, James Perry. So what's it like, James, to work for a data security firm with a $52 billion market cap that was started only 10 years ago by a couple of IR forensics people? Our next speaker, James Perry, knows how amazing that is and what it's like to be a part of that. You can read from his bio that James is the global head of incident response at CrowdStrike, specializing in the response and remediation of large-scale cyber intrusions. But you might not realize from James's bio just how much of a seasoned technologist he is. A degree in systems engineering and a master's in IT from Hopkins. He is responsible for strategic direction of the CrowdStrike incident response services practice, overseeing a worldwide team of experts delivering IR, cloud assessment, compromise assessment services. He's the ultimate high-tech plumber, and having him on speed dial is about as good as it gets. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having us today.
Excellent. And last but not least, no law firm impresses me quite the way Mullen Coughlin does. Like Beckett LLC, what an amazing idea. Build a firm dedicated exclusively to IR and data security. And now Mullen Coughlin is not just a small boutique that does this anymore. They have close to 100 professionals on board, one of whom we have with us today, Carolyn Purwin Ryan. Per Carolyn's bio, you'll learn that she is breach counsel and provides third-party privacy defense legal services. She also aids in IR planning, tabletops, regulatory compliance. But you might miss that Carolyn's also got a master's of law in tax, which means that she has a real head for numbers, probably better than most of the experts here today. And she can appreciate a client's balance sheet along with their cyber exposure. I watched a YouTube video of Carolyn the other day, and I enjoyed her message to clients, which she titled, "Know Thyself. know your crown jewels, know your backups, know your IR plan, know your legacy protocols, know your regulatory requirements. Companies are always so focused on threat intelligence and the latest tools, they forget that important lesson. Great advice from Carolyn. I hope to hear more of it today. So take it away, Carolyn, for this terrific panel on cyber insurance.
Thank you, John. And thank you to all the panelists who are here today. I'm very excited to be joined by all of these experts that are here on this panel. And so who doesn't want to talk about cyber insurance? Really? I mean, really what it comes down to. But in all seriousness, cyber insurance and the coverage associated with it has changed drastically within the past even year or two. So what are we going to be talking about here today? We're going to talk about where it's been, where it's now, and where it's going. And the panelists here today are going to address all the issues associated with forensics, counsel, and why are we going to get involved early? So with that, Scott, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot first. So historically, from an insurance perspective, Scott, I mean, why do we even need to get cyber insurance? What are we talking about? Where did this all begin?
So it all began as an outgrowth, because I know this is super fascinating, but it all began as an outgrowth of errors and omissions coverage for technology firms. Because back in the day, prior to 2002, who needed more than that? There wasn't data breach notification statutes until California passed the first one. There wasn't really much in the way of, if any, ransomware or cyber extortion. And businesses were not entirely dependent upon staying online and being able to be served by computers alone. So insurance always follows liability in that they don't typically sell insurance for a liability that doesn't exist. So the first policies were errors and omissions based. And then as liability changed, as data privacy became a thing, and as cybersecurity became a risk, then policies changed and underwriters scrambled to sell what was seen as a luxury product at the time these first started rolling out to companies. And as more and more companies, particularly retailers, starting getting hit, or people in the healthcare, companies in the healthcare space started getting hit, policies changed. They talked about ensuring and providing coverage for regulatory investigations, coverage for PCI-based risks. And as there were cyber attacks, typically in the denial of service context, taking businesses down, they started to write coverage for business interruption. But at the heart of it, when it transformed from an errors and omissions policy, just defending against or trying to settle allegations of negligent errors, action, omissions in terms of providing services, there became to be breach response coverage for people like you, people like Seth, to come in and say, hey, what happened? And to hire James to say, what happened? And to say, do we need to provide notifications to anybody? That all became part of the cyber policy. And so every time we turn around and cyber criminals have come up with more creative and direct ways to extract money, policies, better policies have been changing to address this changing risk and provide coverage for and risk transfer for the risks that continue to emerge.
And that's what we've done now, right? We've done all that, Scott and Seth and James. I know you guys are all very familiar with, where we are now too. I think that's really where we want to jump to, because I know we have, time constraints here, and certainly want to hear from, Seth, maybe even if you want to jump in and say, like, where are we sitting now? And Scott, where are we sitting now in terms of cyber insurance, and how has this developed now to see where the policies are at now?
Sure, Seth, you want to jump in first, and I'll clean up.
Sure. I mean, I think the policies have evolved, as Scott says, with the law and with the liability and other risks, and sort of expanding on as ransomware and cyber extortion claims have become more common, as social engineering risks have become more common, expanding those initial sort of basic breach coverage costs or defense cost coverage to account for these increasing exposures that clients face from incidents, as well as privacy exposures, as basic privacy statutes have expanded the liability that companies face, in addition to cybersecurity incidents to cover for those kind of risks as well.
And to add on to that, I mean, the question of now, like any good litigator, what does that mean, right? Does it mean now as in kind of 2019 to 2022? Does it mean 2022? Because if you look at 2022, anybody that's tried to buy cyber insurance in the last year has wanted to pull out their hair. premiums have gone through the roof. There are carriers that are limiting the total policy limits that are available. There are carriers that have limited how much coverage will be available for ransomware, both by saying the total policy limit will be cut in half and you have to pay a dollar for dollar percentage, so-called co-insurance, a term that makes no sense to me whatsoever, for every dollar paid out for ransomware. There are carriers that are putting in other restrictions. And so the market has reached a pretty interesting inflection point in that some carriers, and there are middle market carriers that are continuing to provide full limits, continuing to provide the same coverage that they were providing in 2020, 2021. But there's been quite a shakeout in the market. And so the process of getting insurance has become significantly more challenging with significantly more inquiries from the carriers and in a different market from a couple of years ago in terms of how underwriters view what they're selling and how they're pressing potential buyers.
And James, is there, I know in terms of forensic space, I know you and I have worked together in terms of incident response incidences, but one of my favorite things is talking about things before happen. What do I always say? Avoid trying to call me at all costs, right? So what can we do? What can we put ourselves and what can we tell from, what is the insurance looking for? Are there things that, companies that partner with CrowdStrike to say, hey, look, what can I do to put myself in the best position, in the best light in order to get insurance?
Yeah, and I think recently, really in the last 2 years, you've seen the maturity of the cybersecurity and insurance industry change. Their insurers, underwriters understand more what the risks are, what the threats are, and I think more importantly, what the mitigations to those are. For dozens of years, insurance underwriters understood if you have a sprinkler system, there's going to be less damage if you have a fire. And they're starting to understand what those mitigations are for the cybersecurity industry and for what we can provide to limit what the damage will be and what the business interruption will be, if there is an attack. And, they're starting to ask questions like, do you have MFA? They've been asking that for a few years. Do you have MFA? But the questions are getting more mature. Do you have MFA on all accounts? Do you have it turned on? Do you have it for email? Do you have it for your admin accounts? They're getting more mature. They're diving a little bit deeper and they're requiring the attestation that you have those things. Another big thing that they're asking for now is, do you have EDR? EDR is great. CrowdStrike, one of the top EDR companies out there, but they're starting to dive more into that. Is it actually monitored? Do you have a managed EDR? Is it 24/7? Do the people managing it for you have the ability to take action to actually stop a threat? It's great at 2:00 in the morning on Saturday to send an email or fire up an alert that there's a ransomware attack about to happen. But if your people are sleeping, you need to be able to outsource that activity or in-house, have the in-house capability to respond to that at 2:00 in the morning on Saturday, because that's when these actors are operating. And I think the last thing that they're really getting to understand more of, do your backups actually work? Are you testing those backup plans? It's great to have backups. You have to have backups. You need to have immutable backups that can't be changed or deleted. But can you actually restore those in a time that makes sense? Like, if it takes you a month to restore your backups aren't viable. It's great that you have that data and you'll get it back. But at some point, the business interruption cost is going to, exceed the cost of potentially paying a ransom. And insurers are looking at that. Lawyers are looking at that type of activity as you move into a breach. So you have to have not just immutable backups, but restorable backups in a reasonable amount of time to get your business up and running.
And also, the IT companies that people do have, because, small companies, medium companies, whatever that may be, a lot of them are also not designed and don't have the knowledge and actually to know how to restore from backups too, right? And that's where, companies like CrowdStrike help you come in and, hey, look, what do we do in the event that we actually do need to restore from backups? Which actually leads me to a really good point, which is like, why do we involve counsel early on, right? From an insurance perspective too. We have all these, I think what's also not known as well out there is that there's so many different things that insurance companies do offer, right? But, and Seth, this might be a question for you. Why bring in insurance? Why bring in lawyers early, right? Here's your sales pitch, right? Why bring in somebody in early and when, before an incident even happens? Why are we talking to lawyers early?
Yeah, I mean, I think in response to an incident, the way we think of it is certainly everything about an incident response is ultimately a legal question. What are an entity's obligations with respect to an incident or a potential incident? is there, is there an obligation to investigate? There's an obligation to notify if they're, under statutory or contractual obligations, obligations to remediate, obligations to preserve data, not just for people like James, but for, eventual litigation or discovery. But exactly as you say, even before an incident, bringing in counsel to help advise on, making sure you have the appropriate mitigation and security enhancements that to prevent an incident or to mitigate it, the scope of an incident, or as Scott highlighted, the issues of obtaining insurance and the difficulties that we're seeing in the market, to have the legal advice on how to structure your insurance application or your security program to be able to obtain the coverage at the best possible price and the best possible terms, and to do all of that as best as possible to protect it under privilege, because as I say, all of these are ultimately legal questions, and having that advice from your communicated with counsel helps protect you if you ever end up in litigation or regulatory investigation, because ultimately those are the types of documents and communications that those adversaries are going to want to use against you after in an incident to bolster their case and increase your potential liability.
Right, because what is the single thing that you think about on the other side? What is the first document that you look for? Do you have a list of recommendations that you didn't actually do? Right? What are the patches that you didn't and one of the things that James talked about, he talked about EDR solution or endpoint protection solutions. That's one of the things that insurance companies are looking for as well. But one of the questions that, and I'm seeing that we are getting a number of questions that are on here. There's a lot of insurance companies that are utilizing things like a single indicator like a Bitsight, right? Do we think that insurance companies are moving to this? And maybe Scott, this is a question that you could answer as well. Why have you involved early on in the process? Do we think that insurance companies are now going to or are using things like Bitsight to take a look at companies?
Having coverage counsel involved early is best practice, not just me patting myself on the back, right? But here's why. The carriers are, almost every single adjuster in the cyber insurance space is a former coverage lawyer or some kind of lawyer one way or the other. They're hiring more and more coverage counsel as adjusters. And so why is that? Why are they using counsel as opposed to a seasoned claim adjuster who's a business person? Why are carriers using outside counsel, outside law firms to handle the claims? Are they saying to them, simply, we don't have enough capacity, so we need you to do it? Or are they saying to them, we could use more capacity, and are they saying as part of that, we want you to find the most coverage possible under these policies? And so in the vast majority of matters, coverage is not a dispute. The vast majority of matters, coverage is not going to be an issue, but there are coverage issues that come about, and I would be stunned if claim adjusters who are inside or outside counsel haven't focused on those right from the get-go. And not only that, but having coverage counsel involved early on not only would protect communications between for the policyholder, but would also help translate and eliminate friction as things move forward. What I mean by that is, if the policyholder wants to resolve something, wants to resolve disputes or questions with customers, clients, et cetera, business partners, vendors, will that be structured in a way that the insurance company says, hey, we're not going to cover that because we don't cover this kind of matter, or you've resolved it without checking in with us? Coverage counsel will come in and say, hey, great idea. Love your idea about how to resolve this. Let's figure out how we can make this work for you and for your insurance carrier. And calling coverage counsel after the fact, after a settlement's already been done, and then the carrier says, oh, well, we're not going to pay it, makes the job significantly more challenging, because you've got an insurance carrier that's dug in, you've got a situation that's already been set up and perhaps even resolved, and now you're as the policyholder having more of a dispute with your carrier. Whereas if you had somebody early on that knows what the carriers are going to assert or what you suspect they're going to assert, it again eliminates that friction so that everybody can move forward and be aligned much better against the claimants.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, Seth, are you, I know one of the things that you were just discussing is, kind of third party litigation, right? what is the ultimate goal is to not get sued as a, a result of this incident. I think I might be asking almost a very silly question coming up, right? But how do we avoid third-party litigation? Are there things, thinking from an insurance perspective, but also, thinking from an insured's perspective? Okay, like, yeah, sure, don't get breached, don't have a cyber incident. We would love to live in a world where that doesn't happen, but it simply just doesn't, right? But are there things, that we could be doing on the front end or even during an incident that you think that could be in an ultimate in avoidance, or things that you would recommend?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are certainly things that, as you say, like if you can avoid being breached at all, that's the easiest way to avoid litigation, but that's just not a reality. So it's sort of, you have to come into this assuming that an incident will occur, and how do you have appropriate incident response plan and procedures in place that will mitigate any exposure that could be created from a litigation point of view. And I think, having, we've talked, this is an insurance panel, and a key thing, both pre-breach and post-breach, is making sure you have the insurance in place, that it's the right insurance for your company, and both in terms of types of coverage as well as limits, and that you understand your obligations under that policy should an incident arise, how to notify and obtain that coverage. But also, and I think James can talk about this a little bit more in detail, that a lot of these insurers offer pre-breach counseling services as part of that insurance, and knowing what those are available so that you can take advantage of those to mitigate your litigation exposure. But just sort of some general, IR tips is to help mitigate that litigation risk. Is a key thing is be careful what you say. Be careful what you say about your security before an incident, your general practices, and be careful what you say about the incident after it's occurred. Because almost inevitably those statements will form the basis of claims and allegations against the company. If you represent, we had the best security, we guarantee your information it will be secure. That's a textbook example of a misrepresentation claim. But then saying something afterwards about, we had information that was stolen, we've seen fraud occurring, we've had reports of identity theft. Now you suddenly have an allegation that can be used to support and defend against a motion to dismiss that there is standing and there is injury. We've seen cases, whether they survive a motion to dismiss or not, turn on those exact type of statements. So knowing what to say and what not to say is very important. Right. But also, and also just don't ignore the problem. I think, too many times we all see, this couldn't have happened here, or this information couldn't have been breached, or our MFA was turned on and secure, and there's no way it could have been, this access could have happened. And as James and all of us can attest, that's inevitably where it seems to have turned out.
The first inclination that everybody has when an incident does occur is, to just, send an email out right away, right? To communicate, right? But I always say, take a step back. We don't know what we don't know yet, right? Involve people like, myself, like you, like James, right away, but also be calling people like Scott right away, just to his point, right? Because you need to know about your coverage. You need to know about what options are available to you. I know the other inclination people also do is, I don't want to call my insurance because my premiums are going to raise, right? Those misnomers, and I feel like I get that question and I get that comment a lot, right? Is because if I call, that's what's going to happen. And I think having an understanding as to what your actual coverage is and what the capabilities are under that coverage, I think is critical. And James, that actually leads my question to you is, one of the things that, you were talking about earlier, endpoint protection solutions and things like that, what are the things that you work with insureds on a proactive stance to talk about, like, is it pen testing? Do you guys do, things to do for HIPAA compliance? Like, what are the things that, there are insurance companies that you see are offering?
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing a number of things that the insurance companies are offering to help, limit the risk and provide mitigations. The number one thing that we see right now is, deals and pre-approved vendors to use for their services, whether that's, pen testing, making sure that the outside and inside of your environment is secure, providing discounts on, EDR solutions and backup solutions. But, I think it's the second kind of big thing that they're offering and making sure that you understand as you do preparation for an incident is understanding who is part of the ecosystem for your insurance provider. Who is the IR provider? Are they do you know them? Are they on panel? Do you have an IR retainer with them? Can you get an IR retainer with them that will be covered and be reimbursed by insurance, once you have an incident or when you have an incident? Those are some of the number one things that I recommend. Have an IR retainer, make sure it's with the pre-approved vendor, because speed is what matters when you have an incident. We see kind of when it comes up and down the maturity level of clients is the most mature companies with the cybersecurity plan, they call two people to start. They call their breach counsel and they call their IR provider. And typically those happen almost simultaneously, where when they call their IR provider, breach counsel is already on the phone. As we move down into the smaller sides of businesses and less mature organizations, they tend to call their insurance provider first, which doesn't necessarily lend to the speed of response. They didn't have a plan on who they should call. They just know that they had this one number for their cyber insurance policy. They didn't know what vendor they were going to use. They didn't have no idea how that would work with their technology. They didn't have discussions with breach counsel prior to an incident. So it takes, and even sometimes just more hours to understand, who can help me in this incident. And that can slow things down and lead to ransomware actually being deployed, data theft actually occurring. We handle a number of incidents now where, due to the speed in which a client contacts us for having a retainer, the speed in which we're able to deploy technology visibility and work with their partners, ransomware never happens. Data theft is limited. And then we can work on and focus on how do we keep them secure? How do we make sure that, those don't happen and that their business actually was never interrupted? Those are the keys that speed lead to, and having an understanding of who's in your ecosystem, depending on your insurance provider, are very key to, having a successful response and, not having to work with Scott because you don't have that coverage hit from business interruption or ransomware payment. And, having to work too much with Seth and his team because you don't have any, liability and there is no injury and, no one has standing to sue you. They'll sue you anyways, but, Seth will get those thrown out. But, those are speed, knowing your team, and knowing that it's not just your insurance company. It's not just your lawyer. It's not just your IR provider. We've heard from, I think in the beginning panel, we had strategic communications also key. What do you say publicly? And working with your insurance companies to make sure you have providers for that, because that's the worst thing that can happen in IR is saying the wrong things, publicly or even to your employees, because an email to employees in a data breach scenario might as well just be a public email.
Always read an email like you're going to have it put in front of you in a deposition, right?
Yep.
That's always the key, right?
And that your mom's going to be the one reading.
Right. Exactly.
Carolyn, can I jump in on something that you and
please.
James were talking about? You talked about premiums going up and do I give notice? And James talked about kind of order of phone calls. Warms my little heart that little companies, call their carrier first, because it all comes down to that question of notice, right? Companies say, oh gosh, my premium's going to go up. I'm going to get dropped. Here, the unfortunate reality is that the insurance industry has done a fantastic job at forcing companies to have 20/20 foresight, predicting the future. What I mean by that is you can sit back and say, well, I don't know how bad this is going to be, so I'll just wait. I don't know this is going to exceed my retention, so I'll just wait. Insurance companies have established law that says, well, if you don't tell us right away, we can deny coverage for late notice. And not every carrier is going to do that. And I've had adjusters say, well, I'm glad you took steps to mitigate right away. I could deny coverage for late notice, and it was in a jurisdiction where there's no requirement of the carrier to be prejudiced, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to start paying the bills from and eroding the retention from the date you contacted me. But that's not what every carrier does, and that's certainly not what outside counsel will do. So you're forced to give notice under this view of the world from carriers right away. And you're forced to tell them, and unfortunately, because you can't predict, is this going to be a large claim or is this going to be nothing, how it's going to unfold, they put you in the box of saying the first call should be to the carrier. So you start eroding your retention. You start counting the dollars spent towards either the policy or the retention.
Yeah. And I have a thought just to pick up off of what Scott's saying. And I think that we're talking a lot about communications, and particularly communications with the insurer. And where you're in a world where Scott's describing, you have to give that early notice and you have to be communicating with your insurer in order to ensure that you have the right coverage. I mentioned privilege earlier, and we could probably spend an entire hour just talking about that one issue. But particularly since this is an insurance panel and thinking about the privilege issues around the insurer, and it's about balancing protection of the privilege of the investigation, protecting your internal work product, but at the same time meeting whatever contractual obligation you have to cooperate with your insurer and provide the necessary information to support your coverage claim. And so really it's about thinking about making sure that those communications are done consistent with the privilege, that you have, you're getting the right advice from your counsel on how to provide that information that sort of will protect that privilege, because the insurer will be asking for the same kind of information that the adversary is. Can we see the forensic report? Can we talk to James? Can we get on the phone and give us all the information about that? And then you're exposing yourself to potential waiver of your privileged work product and investigation materials. So having counsel there to say, here's how we're going to communicate to the insurer. We're going to have, specific non-privileged communication, ideally oral, but if you have to have it in writing, make sure it's a specifically created document that you're providing to your insurer that gives them the non-privileged actual information about the incident and investigation. And to exactly your point earlier, only note what you know, like only what is known. Don't get ahead of yourself and provide that awareness. So it's a balancing act, but it's very important. And I think one of those key points, as you're saying earlier, about early intervention of counsel in an incident.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a lot of questions on here about Bitsight and how it affects coverage. So Scott, I'm going to turn that right over to you. In your opinion, how does the utilization of Bitsight by a number of the insurance companies affect your coverage?
So it shouldn't, unless you turn the question to the application, and we're seeing that more and more. If Bitsight's saying, hey, we think the following thing's happening, if the policyholder is unaware of it, then there'd be a question of, hey, when should you have given notice? If the carrier says we found the following things, well, the carrier's already on notice. It's kind of crazy to say you were late in giving us notice of something of which we alerted you. But beyond that, there's a question of when did you give notice? And then there's a question of what does Bitsight say? What are the findings? And is a super aggressive carrier going to say, well, let's look at your application and what did you say there? If your application was either did not address that, then you're okay. You should be okay. I shouldn't say you are, because I'll never give it an absolute in this situation, other than saying I'm never going to give you an absolute. You should be okay. But if there are questions about the application and framed as, well, we're using this to evaluate our coverage and we need to continue our investigation, you should have an alarm bell going off. In a perfect world, the best practice would be to have an alarm bell going off in your mind, because why does the carrier need to know what your application said in comparison to what Bitsight's telling them or telling you, other than to say, well, why did you say you do the following things and we think that, you did not?
And then if you're using somebody off panel, does that affect your coverage? I know that question comes up very often, but I'll softball that right to either to Seth or to Scott.
I'll start on Seth. You see this a lot as well. Yes, the short answer is yes. And the extremes range from some carriers say you cannot use somebody off panel. We will not let you, and force you to switch. Some carriers will say, we'll give you an incentive if you switch to panel providers. We'll give you more coverage, or we'll give you less coverage if you go with your provider. And some carriers will say, we'll pay you the rate that we pay our preferred providers for your panel counsel. And so if the policyholder engages a firm that charges, pick your number, and panel counsel's rate is a third of that, and that's not to say panel counsel's rate, I'm not going to comment on either end of the scale there, then the policyholder has to make the determination, okay, well, I want to stick with my preferred team, and therefore I'll make up the difference, or it's not worth it to me, I'm going to switch, or then come back to the carrier and say, well, hang on a second, your proposed rate of $185 an hour is completely unreasonable. And if you're in California, for example, if you have a dispute, say, well, show me where you've paid $185 an hour for partners for a sophisticated class action defense, and you're supposed to pay the rate that you actually pay others in that same area per statute for the same kind of claim. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Seth with that as my overview.
Right. And Scott, I think you, I mean, highlighted all the key issues. And I think to steal a little bit of James's thunder, that point about that's not a negotiation that you want to have when you are in the middle of an incident response, when you're facing down a complaint in a class action case or other, where you have a regulator inquiry that's pending and you're trying to identify counsel and incident response personnel. So identifying, you know, who's on panel with your insurer, what are the particular requirements for pre-approval or approval of counsel, and lining that up in advance, you know, taking the time before an incident occurs so you know not only who is your outside, you know, who is your breach counsel, who is your preferred, you know, forensic investigator, and but also will my insurer cover them at a rates that we all can agree to, so that you're actually doing the work of incident response as opposed to negotiating with all these different parties in your counsel and in your insurer trying to get the matter started as time is ticking away in those early important days, as James highlighted.
Yeah, and I think one of the very important things there is to understand for incident response, you never know what you're going to get. Every incident is different. I have gone into incidents and gone to, you know, one of our, you know, IR leaders on my team and been like, hey, can you take this incident? I know your wife's having a baby in a month. This one will be done by then. And, you know, their kid's in preschool by the time it's actually done. Because it turns out to be that it was a lot more complicated. It was a much more systemic issue than we thought from first instant. And I've seen companies make that mistake where they go with someone off panel, or, you know, someone they just happen to be using and saying, hey, this is going to be simple. It'll be done in a week. And then, you know, in the long term, you know, 3 weeks after that, we're brought in because they realize it is going to be a long running issue and they want to make sure it's aligned with their insurance company. And it's definitely something you want to figure out early and before a breach. You know, that's keep coming back to that it's everything you do during a breach and our response is directly affected by the preparation that you had. You need to have a plan. Everyone needs to have a plan, but you need to practice that plan. You need to do tabletops at both the technical level, but more importantly, at the executive and external party level. You know, having those tabletop exercises with, you know, your SOC team and your CISO in the room, those are great. You need those. But you need the ones in the room where your external counsel is there, where your breach counsel is there, where your, you know, external communications firm's there, your IR provider is there, and then others from outside the business that are in the business outside of security, where your CFO is involved, your CEO is involved in those tabletop exercises and those simulations. Because when there is a big incident, the reality is the people making the big decisions are going to be the CEO. They're going to be the COO because they have strong business impacts. And you don't want the first time that they meet their security team or their outside counsel to be, you know, 3 weeks into, you know, a breach that's on the front page of the newspaper. Well,
and James, and to your point, I mean, there's a reason why there are, you know, companies such as yourselves, like myself, exactly like Seth, who actually do this day in and day out. We've been previously vetted by the insurance companies, right? And there's a reason why there is a list of vendors that carriers utilize in these particular instances. It's because, you know, I hate to say it, but they're the experts when it comes to this field, right? We want to be able to help you as fast and as efficiently to get you back up and running in a safe and efficient manner as quickly as possible. And there's a reason behind that. So why not meet, if the carriers are allowing you, they're encouraging you to meet us, right? Meet us in advance. Don't call, you know, wouldn't you rather meet me in a better calm environment? I'm a nice person. Don't be afraid to call, right? So I always say, meet the people and take advantage of all the things and all the coverages that are available from an insurance carrier perspective. There are the things, you know, again, to Scott's point too, there are so many things that that are available from a coverage perspective early on. There's things that, you know, there are tabletop exercises. You want to talk to James and do a tabletop exercise. So then, you know, go throughout the Wizard of Oz and go behind the curtain and see exactly what it is to go through an incident. And I think that's what some of the things that people are missing out on is, hey, look, there's things to avoid having to go down this road. And I know that there's a couple of minutes remaining, and I know we're getting some of these additional questions that are on there. Okay, well, and I'll put this to Seth. When do you call in terms of an incident? when do you call your insurance? I guess, and this would be to everybody on this call. I mean, who wants to answer this fun question? When do you call when an incident actually occurs? When do you call?
I think is if you're in the portion of your incident response plan where you're notifying your counsel, you're engaging your outside service provider, you want to make sure you're notifying your carrier. You may not have an actual, and Scott can weigh on this certainly too, but like even if you're not sure if you have an incident, as I read all the policies, investigations of a potential incident are covered. So you want to make sure from that day that that $1 that you're spending, in that incident response is going to be covered as much as possible. And so getting your carrier on notice early on is really important.
Right.
Right. And that's the best way to eliminate fights. We're not saying that the carrier is right, that you have to call them from literally the first phone call before you call anybody else. We're not saying that that's what the law will require if you have a fight. But if you want to avoid having a fight, which is like, that's the perfect world, avoid having the conversation, well, why does it matter? And I didn't know. Avoid having that call of, well, I'm not going to start counting anything until you contact me. If you contact the carrier right away and let them know, even if you're investigating something that you're not sure is something, if it turns out it's nothing, if it turns out it remains within your self-insured retention, then ultimately at the end of the day, that shouldn't bother the underwriter. It shouldn't bother anybody. It shouldn't affect how they treat you at renewal, which is always the concern. And it should demonstrate to them, actually, in a weird way, sophisticated underwriters have said, even at big conferences, I am more suspicious of a policyholder that says I had no incidents and no events ever, as compared to someone that said, oh, I had a couple and they were small and they were resolved within the retention, because they have said the people that have no incidents and no anything don't realize that they've had events. Whereas the people that resolved them within retention means that they took care of it right away. We didn't have to pay anything. My loss ratio as the secret was unaffected. So I can continue to say, hey, look, I'm selling policies to good risks and we're making money for the carrier. So that's a different way of looking at it than simply, well, I want to wait and see, or I think I can have an argument, or my state requires prejudice to the carrier. Great arguments. Love them. I make them all the time. Others make them as well. Why make the argument if you don't have to make the argument?
Well, and I always say call early, because you get in touch with, everybody that's sitting on this panel, right? Or, right now, because one of the other things that you want to be avoiding is destroying evidence, right? How many times do I get called 2 or 3 days because we try to fix things, and then James is put in a situation where he's like, look, the evidence has been destroyed, and you don't want to have that adverse inference. I'll put Seth right up there, an adverse inference potentially against you, where then you could be accused of destroying things, and then you have the adverse inference potentially against you as well. So why put yourself in that position? We're here to help. Insurance is here to help. That's the reason why you get it, right? And they've been doing this for forever. So you use what you got, is always my mentality. But I know we're running short on time. In terms of last thoughts, where do you think things are going in the future, guys? Any last thoughts? I'll go around. Seth, you first.
Sure. I think, a key thing from a litigation insurance risk point of view is we're seeing more and more statutes coming out and creating, statutory damages and new rights of action. I think that'll be very interesting to see how the insurance industry responds to those kinds of claims. And as we've seen with CCPA and others, how that affects the liability risks under insurance.
James?
I think, where we're going, I think we're going to see the industry mature more questions, harder questions, more detailed questions when you're renewing your policy. So, don't start renewing your policy 1 week before it's due and scramble on the Friday night. Think about that throughout the year. Those should be, work with your brokers and the underwriters to understand what are they going to ask next year. So you have those answers for those, and you're not, calling us, our product salespeople on the Friday night before your policy's due saying, hey, I really need EDR. That should be part of your plan. Cyber insurance renewals should be part of your greater cybersecurity, procurement plan, and what you need to do and buy and do to actually renew at the end of that year.
And Scott?
Trust but verify. Trust your insurance carrier as a business partner, but verify that they're operating as a true business partner and got your best interests in mind.
Okay, well, we didn't go over time, which is exactly what I promised. Thank you guys all. I really appreciated everybody's time today, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks for bringing the energy. We appreciate it. Seth, Scott, James, thank you guys so much.